The impudence, the audacity, the unmitigated gall of those Knuckleheads of Liberty podcasters, daring to voice opinions outside the mainstream of accepted thought. Listen if you dare. It's angry, it's funny, it's even sometimes sad, but it's always based on freedom and justice, as you will see. Here's our host, Jason McPhee.
It is April 17, 2023, and welcome to the Knuckleheads of Liberty, where we're bringing you the people and the organizations fighting for liberty around the country and in your region. Today, we're going to be talking with Jim Lakely, Vice President and Director of Communications for the Heartland Institute, a free market think tank that focuses on the environment and energy, among other topics. But before we get into that, let me introduce you to the rest of our panel. In our upper left-hand corner, we have Leon the Word Brathwaite, last word in Liberty. He is a retired engineer in the state of California. In our lower left-hand corner, we have our screaming eagle of freedom, Tim Everett. He is a pilot in the state of California. And in our upper right-hand corner, we have Jim Lakely, who I just introduced. And my name is Jason McPhee, and I'll be your host. So let's jump right into it. Jim, you want to tell us a little bit more about what it is that Heartland does and what you guys are focused on over there?
Yeah, so it's an honor to be on the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast. That's such a great title. I am very jealous that I didn't think of something as cool as that for our own podcast, which is called In the Tank, which we do every Thursday live at noon Central Time. But it's called In the Tank because the Heartland Institute is a think tank. We're a free market, libertarian, conservative. We're called, labeled in lots of different ways. But we were founded in 1984 by a bunch of economists and businessmen in Chicago who got around a table. They used to have liberty lunches where they would discuss libertarian thought and philosophy and free markets. And they decided that the Midwest needed its own national think tank. And they based it in Chicago, to be kind of like what the Cato Institute is in Washington, D.C., or, Reason out in, or the Ayn Rand Institute, for instance, out in California. And so since 1984, we have been fighting and researching free market and liberty and promoting them to mostly state legislators. But we've been communicating the message of freedom and the value of free markets and the danger of large government for now almost 40 years. So that's what we've been doing. I've been with the Heartland Institute since 2008, and I've been Director of Communications since 2010. And I was appointed Vice President 2 years ago, I think. So that's that. And we focus really just on domestic policy. I apologize for jumping in again, but we don't deal with foreign policy. We actually don't even deal that much with social issues. You figure there's lots of think tanks out there that actually, or organizations out there that deal with things like abortion rights or gay marriage or things like that. We're staunchly constitutionalists. We're pro Second Amendment, but there are other think tanks like that deal with foreign policy. So we thought it was really important to focus on the United States and how free markets and greater liberty are important to advance. And we see that the need for a think tank like that is just as great now, even greater now than it was in 1984.
Two things jumped. Well, I was just going to say real quick, two things jumped out at me real quick when you were talking about. One, you guys talked about being located in Chicago, and I think about the think tank of the Chicago School of Economics. I mean, that just sort of jumps out. Are you guys at all connected to that? Is that or any people that are in your group somehow tied into that?
We're not directly connected to that, but our founding president, Joe Bast, attended the University of Chicago. And we have, we've had senior fellows and people, we've had events at the University of Chicago. It has been a while, but, so it's not an accident that a libertarian free market think tank was founded in the same city in which the University of Chicago, again, the Chicago School of Economics, was so prominent. And so, yeah, that was we were founded by economists. So it was very much connected, at least philosophically, to the University of Chicago. Milton Friedman, as a matter of fact, was a big fan of the Heartland Institute, and he supported greatly our efforts to push school choice, which obviously was a big issue for Milton Friedman.
Well, the other thing I was going to mention real quick too is 1984. Gosh, was that an accident that year?
I didn't. To be honest, Jason, I never actually made that connection that it was out in 1984. But yeah, that's quite the connection. You're absolutely right. Sometimes it's bizarre that we are now living in 1984, not the year, but the book.
2023 very much feels like 1984. Go ahead, Leon. You jump in.
Yeah. So, Jim, you spoke about the Heartland Institute and its philosophy of free markets and about believing in liberty and freedom and all these sort of things. Do you believe, or does the Heartland Institute believe that as a country, are we moving towards greater freedoms, greater liberties, or are we moving to less of those things?
I think it's obvious, and I think all three of you gents would agree that we were moving toward less individual liberty and less freedom in this country. I mean, people talk about, it'd be nice if we, free market capitalism, there's problems with it. And I would respond, well, it'd be great if we actually gave it a try. Because our economy right now is very much regulated by government. We don't really have free market capitalism in the way that, well, say Milton Friedman would advocate. We've gone away as a country and certainly as a society globally, the West in general has gone away from trusting markets and the people to make the right choices, be there for their own personal consumption or for policies. You let the markets decide these things. It's become less so that way. And so, like I said, we don't really have free market economics or free market capitalism practiced really anywhere in the world. I mean, our own markets here, just on energy, for instance, which is something that the Heartland Institute is very sharply focused on. We don't have energy markets that are regular. Let's just say this. We don't have energy markets that follow free market principles. We have energy markets that are manipulated by government to achieve a certain policy end. In other words, subsidizing green energy, forcing us into electric cars that the consumer, that the market would never choose because it's too expensive, it's unreliable, and it's going to be a disaster. And we're doing this right now. So yeah, we have a lot less freedom economically and personally than we did in 1984, 1994, even 2004.
So this then raises a very to me a very disturbing question. Does that mean that the message of socialism on central controls and central planning is more powerful than the message of freedoms and liberties and free markets and all those things? Is that the very obvious takeaway from what you are stating, which I happen to agree with?
I mean, I think we talk about this at the Heartland Institute in our own offices and among emails and chats with each other, and then on the In the Tank podcast that the Heartland Institute does every Thursday. And it's that we've had generations of children who are now young adults who were not taught to value freedom. In fact, they were taught to fear freedom. They were taught that somebody else's freedom is dangerous. Individually, they think that they should have. They feel free, or they feel that they should be free to do as they like. But the minute something abuts against their own values, they think that freedom should be taken away from somebody else. And so that mindset, that's been generations of children who have now grown up to be, like as I said, young adults who don't believe in freedom. They fear it, and that's completely against the founding of this country, and it's completely against actually moral human interaction. That you should not be forcing anyone to do anything against their will. If you want to buy an electric car, fine, go buy it if you want. But to be forced to do it is immoral. And you can apply that to any policy in the United States or around the globe. If you are forcing somebody to make a choice they would not make on their own, that is not moral.
Well, it's funny in mentioning the fact that kids really aren't learning this kind of stuff going through school nowadays. I also think too, it's funny that things like Animal Farm in 1984 aren't also kind of standard reading anymore in schools, and maybe there's a connection there. But this does bring up one of the questions is, and we like to ask this to all of our guests as well, but since obviously government monopolized school isn't where you're really going to learn about markets and liberty, where did you learn about this? What sort of rang your liberty bell?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I like to think I've always kind of had it in me. I think it's it's human nature to want to be left alone, to live your life the way you want. But when I was a kid, we deal with policy at the Heartland Institute. We try to stay away from politics, which is frustrating and kind of pointless sometimes. And we deal with policy. But when I was a kid, I used to watch the McLaughlin Group, sitting on the floor while my dad was watching it on Sunday mornings. And so I was always really plugged in to what's going on in the country and politically. But I went to the University of Pittsburgh. You can see I was in the drum line at Pitt. You can see the thing over my shoulder here. And my first class, I was trained as a writer. I was a journalist before I became director of communications at the Heartland Institute. It's a shabby profession now, but it wasn't too bad when I was a journalist back then. But I learned how to, I was a writer. I took writing classes in college, and my first writing class was actually also cross-referenced to the women's studies department. So they tried to teach me how to write like a woman, whatever that means. There was this hard left feminist stuff. I was reading Andrea Dworkin and all these other radicals and writing about it. And, I figured if I could get through that kind of training or that kind of attempted indoctrination with my principles for liberty and free markets intact, then I think I'm probably going to be a pretty good, maybe I should do that for a living. Maybe I should continue to do that as a living. So, I've always just appreciated the founding of this country. The way our liberty, we created a new country, a new society that the world had never really seen. And of course, the founding fathers were inspired by, the best ideals of ancient Greek society, in which, the whole idea of the autonomy of the individual, and that an individual's rights are paramount. And that if the government is infringing on your rights, that is a society that is going to inevitably tumble toward totalitarianism, and that's what we're seeing now. And so, I've just always wanted to live my life the way I want to live it, and I've just internalized those feelings, and it's been a lens looking at the outside world and being troubled by what you see. Again, as I said, there's been generations of kids brought up to not think that way at all. They think collectively. They think that people's feelings and hurting someone's feelings is a sin of some sort. It's like, just let it roll off your back and move on with your life. As long as I'm not physically harming you or stealing anything from you, you should leave me alone to live the life the way I want. And the trouble with our society now is that the people that believe like I just described, and everybody here on this podcast, it's hard to win society over sometimes with that kind of an attitude that I just want to be left alone. The young people, they seem to have been indoctrinated that their life has to have some sort of purpose, and that purpose is to collectively bring us to the future and make everybody agree with each other. That's not what this country was founded on. And in fact, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Yes. And the desire to make sure that everybody has equal outcomes leads to a tyranny eventually. And, people, my friends and people that aren't really into this sort of stuff, when I would talk about things like this, they would say, you're a little nutty in the head, Jim, that's never going to happen. Yet here we are. We are in a society now in which the autonomy of the individual is probably less valued than it has been in any of our lifetimes. And I would love to see it turn around. That's what the purpose of the Heartland Institute is to educate people to understand that your individual autonomy is sacrosanct, and that, without freedom and liberty, society and actually wealth and prosperity all fall with it. And so, that's what podcasts like this are about. That's what organizations like the Heartland Institute are about. And we are successful in the audiences that we touch. And I think it's great to have a program like this so we can touch even more people.
So do you look, Tim, do you want to say something? I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask what factor human nature has in these principles. What would you say about human nature, just as it relates to this whole idea of individualism versus collectivism collectivist thinking?
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually a really good question. Maybe we could all kind of explore that question, Tim. It's, one of the things that modern society, from, Marxism especially, and other isms, is that they try to, they don't take into account human nature, right? They try to overrule or reshape human nature, which cannot be reshaped. Now, if you think back to the first organizations of humans, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, when we came out of, when we were living in caves, socialism and collectivism was survivalist. You would form a tribe, and then your tribe, the stronger your tribe was, the greater chances that each individual in that tribe were going to survive. You couldn't really make it out there on your own. But of course, as civilization advances, people can pretty much make it on their own. But then, with a capitalist system in which there's voluntary exchange of goods and services and transactions, that's a different kind of society that is more advanced than tribalism. But now it seems that we are trying to impose tribalism back upon modern society. That your tribe is the color of your skin. Your tribe is your sexual identity, and so the leftist, the Marxist, is reinstituting tribalism to divide us from each other and to get us away from the idea that the collective good, in a generic sense, is advanced when individuals are pursuing their own well-being. That capitalism isn't evil because people make money. People make money in capitalism because they're providing goods and services that are needed and wanted by other people. And so, so again, we're moving toward this kind of tribalism that is destroying the most successful way humans have been organized in human history, which is what we experienced in the West, not certainly in the East, not in the Soviet Union, but in the West in the 20th century. It created capitalism pulled more people out of poverty than any program or any intent to bring people out of poverty. Just the free market created so much wealth and pulled people out of poverty. And now with energy policy, we are imposing upon Africa and other emerging economies green energy that will not work. It will never pull them out of poverty. So, it's the ultimate pulling up the ladder behind you after the West has made itself wealthy, healthy, and a lot fewer people in poverty. We are sentencing the people that live in these emerging economies, what we used to call the third world, to perpetual poverty based on our virtue signaling and the myth that carbon dioxide by humans is causing a climate catastrophe and we're all going to die unless we stop.
But Jim,
that was a good one.
That's very good. I really like that. But I would like what role. Now, what I think is happening is this intersection between journalism and activism, where the media, essentially the mainstream media in particular, has taken aside. What role do you think the media is playing in disseminating this misinformation about the central planners, where the central planners can fix everything for us? What role do you think the media is playing in this?
They're playing a propagandist role, and they're doing very well at it, to our chagrin. Heartland Institute is known globally for our work pushing back against climate alarmism. We work with scientists from around the world. We just had our 15th International Conference on Climate Change in February in Orlando, Florida. That was a great success, and it brought people from around the world to talk about the real data and not the propaganda that humans are causing a climate crisis. We're countering it with science and logic and reason. The media is really good at emotionally manipulating the masses into thinking that, they don't think, to feel that a climate catastrophe is nigh, and we have to do something, and that doing something is destroying our society, really. But by the time these people realize it, when their lights go out and their heat is gone, it's going to be way too late. It will be so far down the road that misery will. That's the one thing that will be collective: misery. Except for the elites, of course, they'll be fine. But the media, I gave you that example because it was like 10 years ago, the Los Angeles Times declared publicly that they would no longer allow any letters to the editor or op-eds countering climate alarmism to be printed in their pages. The BBC has a climate disinformation correspondent. Several of our corporate media outlets have climate misinformation reporters. And so their entire job is to propagandize the people with leftist ideology. It's not to report news. That's why it's such a shabby profession now. I wasn't a propagandist when I was working for the newspapers I worked for back in the early aughts, the early 2000s. I was reporting news from both sides, and I was letting the readers make up their own minds. Now our modern media, our corrupt corporate media, as I like to refer them to, their job is to indoctrinate for the state. Both in the United States, but especially around the world. And if you dare to question any of the narratives of the corporate media, they will, again, you use that term, Leon, misinformation. You are a peddler of misinformation and must be suppressed. Or even worse, you're peddling disinformation, which is purposely lying just for asking questions, just for presenting, for instance, climate data that shows that, for instance, hurricanes are not getting more frequent and stronger, despite all the promises that that's what's going to happen if we kept driving our SUVs. If you present that information on a chart that's from NOAA, you will be labeled as peddling misinformation about the climate. You will never be able to get something like that printed in the Los Angeles Times or at NPR or at the BBC. So the media is actually perpetuating our accelerating march to statism globally right now.
It's funny. I mean, we saw a big parallel with this with COVID as well. I mean, a lot of similar thinking where they drummed together a narrative really fast, and then suddenly, if you were outside the narrative, we saw real efforts to I guess generate that ministry of truth, I guess, to make sure that we could essentially just make sure there was one narrative, and it's a changing narrative, whatever the whatever the administration wants at the time.
Well, you just screwed over your own podcast by saying the magic word COVID, Jason. I was trying to avoid it, but you just stepped in it, buddy.
Yeah, we step in it all the time. There is one thing though too I wanted to bring up, and you mentioned founding fathers, 1776, and Tim also brought up the idea of sort of human psychology, I guess, a little bit, and that brings up the fact that in that time Adam Smith was happening at the same time, and I'd like to think that our founding fathers kind of knew a little bit about what he was writing about, because Wealth of Nations, 1776. So. But
they absolutely knew about Adam Smith, and we're incorporating his ideas into the society they were trying to build, because that's the bedrock of freedom, is free market capitalism and limited government. I mean, you think about the limited government of checks and balances that our founding fathers set up for us, and that famous quote by or maybe it's apocryphal, but a woman asked Benjamin Franklin, what have you created? He says, a republic if you can keep it. If you think about the government they set up then to the government that we experience now, where you have the administrative state, what you can call permanent Washington, that's what Tucker Carlson calls it. But you basically have an administrative state that is unaccountable to anybody. It's so vast and powerful that it's basically uncontrollable, the Leviathan. They are the ones who actually rule us, and we're not governed. We are ruled, and we're largely ruled by the administrative class in Washington, D.C., or the administrative class, let's say, at the United Nations and other global bodies. I actually sometimes I wonder if the founding fathers would have thought that this country in any form would have survived 250 years. I bet none of them thought it would. They were just trying to do the best they could while they were alive and to see how long it would last. So I suppose the United States still does exist, but a United States based in limiting the power of government to rule over its people, that we were supposed to be governed, not ruled. That's where we are now. Modern society, we are ruled. We're not governed anymore.
It seems like one of the some of the challenges we have in dealing with all this stuff is how the left, like you said, sort of controls the information, and of course you guys, I know some of you guys get labeled deniers as well. When you whether it's science denier, climate denier, vaccine denier is the latest one that we've heard. How do you guys deal with that over there at Heartland? I mean, because the climate thing has been going on quite a bit longer than this whole vaccine denier thing, with
Right.
COVID. So.
Well, I mean, it's a slur, obviously. It was popularized by Al Gore probably about a decade ago, and it's intentional. Denier, climate denier is like a Holocaust denier. You're not supposed to. You're not only not supposed to take a Holocaust denier seriously, you're supposed to consider them evil. And so that's why that term has been put upon or used against anybody who questions the alarmist climate narrative. It doesn't matter how much data you throw up in front of it. You're actually not arguing with people who are thinking. These are people who are believing. I like to call it the climate cult, because it has every hallmark of a cult or a religion of some sort.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
there are sins like driving your SUV. There are apostates, guys like me who don't believe in the narrative. That's the out group. It has sacraments like recycling or buying an electric vehicle, or making sure you get your energy from renewable sources and pay extra for that. And so it's very hard to crack through the mind of somebody who has been basically emotionally manipulated and mind controlled, like in a cult. So if they're going to call me a climate denier, I'm going to call them a climate cultist. At least I know that I have data on my side that that sea levels, for instance, are not rapidly accelerating. They're going at pretty much the same rate they've been going for the last couple of hundred years, or thousands of years since the last ice age ended. They won't have any actual data to bring to the game. They will just have their religious beliefs. And so, this is where we really are on not just climate, but a lot of issues. It's, we are libertarians. We value logic. We want to be convinced. Don't force me, persuade me. And so, they have a belief system. We have a data-based logic system that our minds could be changed if the data changes, or if the logic behind something is a little bit more compelling. Our minds can be changed because we're thinking. We're not thinking, and we're not just believing and emoting about these issues the way, frankly, the alarmist side, the climate cultists are. So it's as if we're talking past each other, and I think that's true. But you have to keep trying, because going down the path, this religious zealot path on climate, is going to lead us to economic ruin, and it's going to take all of our freedoms away. It's really the ground zero, in my opinion, of the liberty fight is climate.
I'm still waiting for my climate cultist friends that live in Sacramento to turn their air conditioners off during the summer, but so far, they choose comfort over their sacrifice on the altar of climate change. I don't know why.
Well, it definitely sounds like this is the challenge. And by the way, our invisible hand, James, can you bring up the Heartland's webpage? We forgot to bring that up earlier on. So this is the webpage that they have out there. And Jim, are there any last things you'd like to leave the audience with here? Any last thoughts before we wrap up the show?
Yeah, I would encourage people to check out heartland.org. We just redesigned the website a couple of months ago, so it should be easier to navigate and find things. We have podcasts we put out almost every day. Our flagship podcast is called In the Tank. We broadcast it live on YouTube every Thursday at noon Central Time. We actually have a second show called Climate Change Roundtable that we do every Friday on YouTube at noon Central Time. And this is where you can find a lot of great information about liberty and freedom, but especially, like I said, we're known globally for our work pushing back against climate alarmism. And so heartland.org can be a clearinghouse for you to get the real information, real facts, real data that the mainstream media, the corporate media, is just not given to you.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Jim. And we're going to have, for our audience, we're going to have Jim back on another show to talk about some other, a little bit of a deeper dive on a few other issues. But again, thanks everybody for joining us today. And until the next time, stay tuned and stay free.
Yes, indeed. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, always and forever.
Thank you for listening to the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast. Find us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, your favorite podcast